Welcome to session 68 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This time around, we are going to begin the first part of our examination of Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, with a little bit more in the second session, and that is Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars. A very long scope and, as you can tell, quite dense set of books right here. We may be supplementing in the next session this series with some of the short stories from The Martian. And what we're going to be doing this time around is just looking at these first two books in the trilogy, which is already quite a lot. So we've got Red Mars and Green Mars, both of which are chronicling the colonization and the development of Mars, not just as, you could say, the typical sci-fi place where, either everything is turned into something Earth-like right away or it remains totally alien and foreign, but rather it's, you could say, terraformed or aeroformed, as they're going to call it in the book, in a vast, very complicated set of stages and steps and mishaps and accidents. Now, I should mention, before we go on too much about that, so if you're new to the Worlds of Speculative Fiction, you're wondering what this is a series that started back in 2016, originally as a face-to-face set of lecture discussions, talks with people at the Brookfield Public Library, which was hosting it and featuring it as a monthly series. And we've been looking at narrative worlds in speculative fiction ever since then. We took a little pause when COVID started, and then we went to this new online format, which really isn't that new anymore. And what we do is I present for about 90 minutes. Sometimes we go a little bit longer. I'm guessing we probably may go longer with these. We'll see what happens. And I talk about the world building that goes into the narrative universe of the author. We typically talk, if it's the first time we're looking at the author, about their biography, and we look at some of the things that they say about their own writing. Sometimes we look at reviews of their writing, particularly the series or the books. And we also look at key philosophical themes that are either sort of built into the novels or short stories or whatever it is that we're looking at, or that are right there front and center being worked out and discussed by the author and their characters in the works. And with Kim Stanley Robinson, I would say it's much more the latter than it is the former. I will say several other things before we get fully underway. So this series was, as many others have been, a suggestion and then something that was voted in by my viewers, subscribers, people who follow me in social media. And it wasn't something that was originally on my radar, but I'm actually very happy, as I typically am, with the recommendations that people have made, because this is a really interesting, thought-provoking, albeit rather dense series that I think not everybody might get into, but I certainly have gotten into it. So for whoever it was a couple years back who was suggesting I should do this, and then the people who voted for it, thanks very much for that. I'm glad that I finally got around to it this month, and then the coming month where we'll be discussing Blue Mars and perhaps some of the Martian stories as well. I should point out that these are pretty dense books. So if you haven't read them, this one is 572 pages. Green Mars is even longer, coming in at 600 and 24 pages. Blue Mars is actually even longer here we go, 761 pages. Presumably, if he'd written yet another one, like, pick another color, yellow, orange, purple, black, white, gray, brown, it would have come in even longer because that was the tendency. They are kind of a slog at first. There's a lot of characters, a lot of things going on. It's quite complex plots, but I think that it's actually quite well worth working your way through, if only for the imaginative scope, the depth of detail as well in the handling not just of scientific matters in a variety of different, let's call them domains, but also, coming across in the social sciences and then getting into, let's call it the humanities and religion and matters like that, and existential commitments on the parts of the characters and projections about what, humanity is going to be like 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now. There's so much that is built into this. So with no further ado, we may as well get started. I think that with this, the very first thing that we want to do is give you a taste of the world building that is going on in these two books and in the series as a whole. So we obviously, and I mean obviously for me and for anybody else who has in fact read their way through these works, because it might not be quite so obvious to somebody who hasn't, we obviously want to spend some time on world building at the start, because that is really a central feature of these works in a rather unusual way. But we also don't want to go too deep into it, because we could easily consume the entire time for this discussion in doing that. And there's many other things that we need to get to. Some biography, some of Kim Stanley Robinson's reflections on his own work, some philosophical themes, and other things about world building that we'll get to. But suffice it to say, world building is always important for science fiction, fantasy, horror, things like that. But it takes on an additional depth with these, in part because they are quite literally the characters building a new world. They are colonizing and transforming Mars itself, this vast planet in our solar system that we're able to reach out to and land on. Even in our own time, we've got landers that have explored bits of Mars and things like that. In this case, though, the goal is to take Mars and terraform it, turn it into a place that could be habitable for human beings, and not just human beings, but all sorts of other things from Earth. Animals, plants, fungi, single-celled organisms of all sorts. So the goal is first to get there and survive and start to develop a new scientifically oriented society that will carry out all of these processes. And very quickly, as we're going to see, what's going on Earth and the ways in which we human beings tend to organize things or be organized ourselves is going to massively impact Mars. And so, the world building here is not just telling us about, places that they go or what it's like for them. It's also charting out how these things are changing, and deliberately so, for the characters, the people who are involved. And the lifespan of some of the characters can be quite long. Some of the original 100 colonists, these scientists who trained for years and years, they have their lives, most of them, if they haven't died already, extended by some processes that allow their DNA to be essentially, not broken down the way that it typically is in the aging process, and their lives extended quite far, which is going to provoke some serious issues, which let's put those off for a little while. So what is the world building that's going on? Kim Stanley Robinson is imagining something that, we've been talking about a lot in our own time. And let's say not just talking about, but dreaming about the colonization of the solar system. And, that is probably going to start with Mars. Venus seems pretty tough and inhospitable. Mercury, so close to the sun. I don't know if we're ever going to colonize gas giants like Jupiter and Saturn, and we might send something way, way the hell out to these outer planets, or the asteroid belt or something like that. But Mars seems to be the place where humanity is going to start, if we in fact ever do get around to it. And in these works, that is precisely what happens. It begins with a joint what do we want to call it? Expedition, which includes a whole bunch of Americans with a few other people thrown in there, and a whole bunch of Russians, and they are, sending these people on this massive voyage with all of these supplies and all of this knowledge and training into a new environment, which, now here's where the world building does come in. Kim Stanley Robinson describes all of these things in terms of geography and chemistry, physics, biology, the developments of ecosystems, all the different things that are going on within Mars itself, reservoirs of water, frozen typically, all sorts of deposits of important minerals, volcanic activity. And the human beings get there and they begin to build, they begin to transform, they begin to develop this new world, which goes from being originally, these titles are deliberately chosen, red, to being green, to being a place where the atmosphere is being developed. And interestingly, I should point out too, there's a word that comes up over and over again in there, and it's even going to apply to Earth later on. There's a discussion about whether it's really terraforming or whether it is area forming. Ares is Mars, right? Mars is the Latin, Ares is the Greek. And so the question here is, well, what is actually happening? And this is where the human initiative, we could say, comes in, and human affairs. So the world building isn't just a traditional tale of the bold scientists transforming this environment, and here's all of its features, and they've got a nice plan. No, it's much more complicated than that, because human beings are complicated as hell as well, right? So there's already discussions early on, spurred by this guy Arcady, but also carried forth by Hiroko, one of the other main characters who's in charge of plants and that aspect of developing growth, and winds up having a sort of cult develop around her, as does Arcady to a certain extent. And they're proposing, and many of the other people are thinking about this as well, that there's already sort of like a mission laid out. You need to do this and this and this. But they're not going to. Some people are going to stick to the plan. Others are going to develop a new society. And there's going to be lots of different kinds of inputs after that coming from Earth, including, at the very beginning, a stowaway, somebody who's not even supposed to be there, who we'll later find out in Green Mars calls himself and is called Coyote, right? Sort of a trickster fellow who Hiroko managed to smuggle on board with a lot of work being required on her part to do that. And, Mars is going to end up being colonized by a vast variety of different peoples, cultures, organizations. Companies are going to play a major role in this, as well as countries. We see transnationals turn into metanationals and being, heavily involved in what's going on there. The UN kind of goes in and out of existence. There's all sorts of other things that are happening. Many countries are going to be sending their people up to Mars. There's people who are going there just to make money and then come back. And all of this involves not just the transformation and some conflict and some deliberation about how Mars is going to be transmuted from red to green and ultimately to blue. It also involves people arguing with each other, people proposing how things ought to go. Corporations trying to suck as much resources out of it and take them to Earth. People on Mars, especially after new generations are being born on Mars, saying, Mars for the Martians, Mars for us people. So all of this, you could say, is involved in the world building that Kim Stanley Robinson is carrying out. And interestingly, all of the depicted action is taking place on Mars. I take that back. There is, some very, very early on discussion about getting into the rockets and taking off and all of that sort of stuff, and training at the Antarctic base to get ready for it. But actually the story begins in media res, in the middle of things, with a part called Festival Night, which, takes place after people have already been there and been building for quite a long time. And then we start getting the rest of the story. So what we've got is not a linear development, but a very complex, braided set of developments taking place on Mars, massively influenced by what is happening on Earth. And Earth is getting worse and worse. The environmental problems are getting worse. The political problems are intensifying. Conflict between nations and between companies, corporations, is happening as well. And another thing that destabilizes matters that we're going to talk about, again, a little bit more later on, is the longevity treatments that primarily benefit those who have the wealth to be able to partake in them. And then the rest of humanity on Earth realizes that they've been shut out from this amazing, possible future that the rich and the upper middle class and the developed countries, as opposed to developing countries, are able to afford and enjoy and use to massively extend their power and reach and life. So all of this, we could say, is part of the world building that is happening through the eyes of all of these characters that Kim Stanley Robinson has set up, many of which are killed off in the process, but many of which are able to continue on all the way to the end of the final crisis in Green Mars. I should mention, too, one other thing. So Red Mars ends with a massive revolution and crisis on Mars, which entails breaking a space elevator, this massive, construction that winds up falling on Mars and devastating large amounts of property. In Green Mars, it ends in something like a revolution as well, something else going on. So we've got geography, we've got human colonization and how we transform things. We've got politics and economics and culture, and all of these things are being drawn imaginatively from the world that you and I currently inhabit. Of course, these books are not written right here in our own present, right? Red Mars, 1993, so there's a lot of projection going on, but, on the whole, it is an alternate history at this point, but it's not that alternate, perhaps. And I think there's a lot to recommend this incredible world building that is going on here. You could say Kim Stanley Robinson is showing a lot of other people how to do it on so many different levels all at once. Because Kim Stanley Robinson is a new author to the series Worlds of Speculative Fiction, and since we're going to be doing 2 sessions, one right after the other, on the Mars trilogy, we should spend a bit of time doing, some biography. I don't want to go into this too deeply because I don't want to devote too much time. I want to get into all the other things instead. But it's worth knowing something about the guy. And he is a living author, very involved in discussions in the present, particularly around big sweeping themes like where are we going as a species and where are we taking all the other species with us in the Anthropocene, right? Where we're, at risk of severely damaging this planet as far as human life goes and other kinds of life. So where did all this come from? Kim Stanley Robinson is born in 1952 in Waukegan, Illinois, not too far from where I'm shooting this video, but his family moves out to Southern California, where he's going to spend a lot of time and is still more or less, within that grand region. When he's only 3 years of age, he's the older of 2 boys. His father was an electrical engineer and a project manager working on defense projects. His mother was a teacher, and she instilled in them, as something I can kind of relate to. My mom was also big on promoting reading, development of the mind, and so they read to him frequently. And one of the things that's very, very important, as a total side note, that we know from psychological research is if you want to produce kids who are actual readers, reading books, not just reading things on a screen, well, then you not only need to read to them, you not only need to foster reading, but they need to see you reading as well, and doing so not just for a job, but for enjoyment as something that you want to do. And his family did, in fact, according to Kim Stanley Robinson, model that. And so he will say, and this is coming from his website, I was always in love with reading much more so than with TV or movies or other media. I like to read books and read them at a prodigious rate. So he's absorbing a lot of information. And he talks about his mother in particular. It sounds like this is more his mother's idea than his father's, who was kind of going along with this. He says she believed that physical activity, mental activity, and musical activity were all 3 equally important and gave equal weight to them. That meant that academics, American sports, and high school band were important, and he was involved in all 3 in what he calls a balanced life, which I think is a very valuable thing that they passed along to me. And, he goes through middle school, high school, then goes off and enrolls at University of California, San Diego, 1974, he earns a bachelor's in literature, English literature. In 1975, so pretty quick succession, he earns an MA in English from Boston University out on the East Coast. And then in 1978, while he's engaging in his PhD studies at UC San Diego, working interestingly with Frederick Jameson, who, if you know your critical theory, is a very important person in American reinterpretation of that, particularly with respect to literature. And so in 1978, he moves to Davis, California, taking a break from his grad studies, and he works in a bookstore, Orpheus Books, as a bookseller. Now, that's not just having a job for somebody like Jameson, and I'm reminded, this is going down memory lane, of, not Jameson, but Robinson, of a guy who I knew when I was in graduate school who, with another person, started a bookstore, and it was the place to go for any sort of interesting theory and, offbeat movies and stuff like that. And, that was the sort of place. I asked him, why did you start a bookstore? And he's like, so I could read books. So being a bookseller, especially at that time when there wasn't such an emphasis on let's make a ton of money, right, could be a great opportunity to spend time reading and talking with other people that are interested in that. He also started teaching, and he was primarily doing freshman Ret Comp classes, writing classes at University of California, Davis. And then he completes his PhD, doing his dissertation in 1982 on, interestingly enough, Philip K. Dick. And he produces this, study of the novels of Philip K. Dick. And who got him into that? Friedrich Jameson. And Jameson was somebody who, thought that at that time Dick was somebody well worth studying, quite correctly. And so that's what Robinson did. And he said that it was through that he really discovered the possibilities for science fiction. He says, despite all this childhood reading, I'd never known that science fiction existed. I discovered it late, but found it tremendously absorbing. To me, it was the best possible way to describe how my youth in Orange County had felt, that kind of future shock. So my undergraduate career was kind of a two-track thing where I did the standard undergraduate work, but I did a complete education in science fiction in about 3 years. And then when I started writing short story, they were science fiction short stories without any conscious decision. So he begins writing and developing his craft. Then he meets his wife, Lisa, and they will start an important partnership. He meets her in the 1970s when she was going to University of California, Davis, and he was teaching half-time, writing half-time. And she finishes her PhD in environmental chemistry, and they go to Zurich, Switzerland, because she's offered a postdoctoral research post. And he says, well, I took the opportunity for this to quit teaching, and in 1985 I began writing full-time. Now, before that, he's already got several books coming out. The Wild Shore, part of the Orange County series in 1984. Icehenge, also in 1984. Before going to Zurich, they did some traveling, going to Egypt, Greece, and Nepal, doing hiking in the Himalayas, and that's going to furnish him with material for later work. He's also going to publish The Memory of Whiteness, a scientific romance in 1985, and then The Blind Geometer in 1986. And so they're there in Zurich until 1987, and then Lisa gets a job with the Food and Drug Administration in Washington, D.C., and that's where David, their son, is born. Then they go to Davis, and they join a co-housing community, at least for a while. And Lisa began a job with the U.S. Geological Survey at their office in Sacramento. And I think that, you can see a lot of geological things being reflected in the story about Mars in these books. And then as a full-time writer, but also stay-at-home dad, taking care of their kids for a while. He brings out a whole series of novels. I'm only going to talk about the novels, not the short stories. The Gold Coast, also part of the Orange County trilogy, in 1988. Green Mars, a short piece there, not exactly the same thing as the Green Mars that we're thinking about here, in 1988, and then Pacific Edge in 1990, finishing the Orange County series. Then there's A Short Sharp Shock in 1990. Down and Out in the Year 2000, 1992. It's kind of interesting to be somebody who's projecting into the near future, like Philip K. Dick did too, right? I mean, Blade Runner is long past us for when it was originally supposed to happen. Predicting things, 8 years in the future is kind of a tricky endeavor. Going on, now we get to the actual Mars series. Red Mars, 1993. Blue Mars, 1996. In between, Antarctica, coming out in 1997. We've got all these at that time. Then The Martians, another installation, a bunch of short stories kind of scattered over this timeline, right, in 1999. And then we get The Years of Rice and Salt, situated in a different narrative universe. In 2009, Robinson is going to be an instructor at the Clarion Workshop, teaching other people how to think about these things. Galileo's Dream comes out in 2009 as well. 2010, he's the guest of honor at the 68th World Science Fiction Convention in Melbourne. And in 2011, two important things happen. He presents at this Rethinking Capitalism conference held in University of California, Santa Cruz, and discusses the cyclical nature of capitalism, among other things. Robinson is very much a theorist of where we're going to go in social organization in the future. He's also appointed as a Muir Environmental Fellow in 2011 by John Muir College at San Diego. And then he brings out a whole succession of other novels. 2312 in 2012, now projecting 300 years in the future. Shaman, a novel of the Ice Age. Aurora in 2015, New York 2140 in 2017. You start to see kind of a common theme here about projecting into the future. Red Moon in 2018 and The Ministry for the Future in 2020. And, Robinson, as I mentioned, is quite active and engaged in a lot of discussions and presentations. So this biography is, of course, incomplete, but at least it gives us some sense about how he winds up getting into the writing of these novels, the writing, the research, the reflection, all the conversations that take place. So that's a good summary of what's going on there. Kim Stanley Robinson has given an incredible variety and number of interviews over the years and continues to do so in the present. So I thought it would be useful to cull out some bits from 5 of them that have to do with this series in particular and the idea of colonizing and terraforming Mars, and touch on some other important issues in his craft and world building, and you could say his vocation as a novelist, and through that as an activist, or at least argument maker of sorts. So we begin with an interview with the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's asked, when you're working on your books, do you treat it as a world-building exercise in which the world has its own dynamics, or does the story call the world into being? So the key question, right, about to use the tropes that have been applied to Tolkien and to George R.R. Martin in terms of fantasy, the architect versus the gardener sort of idea. And Kim Stanley Robinson says, I think more the latter, but my story ideas are often somehow world-building ideas. At least this was true with the Mars trilogy. If the story is Mars is terraformed over a few centuries, then this is a big problem for the novel as a form dealing with the centuries, but also a big opportunity. So I would say that my ideas often concern a group of people dealing with a landscape, somehow even the solar system as a landscape, and thus both parts of it come into play at once, so I couldn't say which comes first. And then the follow-up question, in many of your books, things like the weather or the geology of a situation get equal attention, alongside whatever is at stake between the characters, and sometimes even more attention. It is as if you had shifted the novel's attention to a whole other series of relationships. Do you think this is just an aspect of the novel that had not much been explored before, or do you think you're bringing something into the form from other kinds of writing? And his response is, I think there's always been a kind of novel that explores the relationships between people and nature, or a physical situation and challenge, and I've always been interested in these novels as a reader going back to my childhood. So almost every novel has people as the central characters, but sometimes the antagonist is a natural situation, or the setting is not antagonistic exactly, but extremely interesting. Thus, Robinson Crusoe, which naturally I liked. And then I'm remembering James Ramsey Ullman's novels about climbing the Matterhorn, or even Huckleberry Finn and the way the river is a major presence in the novel, the third major character, so to speak, or simply a dominant setting. Also William Golding's Pincher Martin, and really all his first four novels, and so on. The more I think about it, the more I realize that these moments describing people in the world stick out for me, even in novels that are mostly social. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, for instance, Tess working the fields on the moors was for me the most striking passage. Then in science fiction, this often translates into the planetary romance, where the interest, again, is in people dealing with a new landscape. I always loved this kind of sci-fi in Jack Vance, early Leguin, Edgar Pinghorn, Frank Herbert's Dune, certain early John Brunner, and really the whole subgenre of the planetary romance. These were among my favorite sci-fi novels. That's one of the reasons my Mars novels took up so much of my writing career. So he goes on, he says, I also took an interest in George Stewart's experimental novels, where a natural situation or process was made the protagonist of the story, as in Storm or Fire. This is also somewhat true of Earth Abides, and his other novels centered on an inhuman process, Oral's Exam. These books of his tended to convince me that people were the necessary centers of novels, but they were like limit cases that established how far you could take things. So not only were these the kinds of novels that were capturing me most, but all along I've spent a lot of time hiking in the Sierra Nevadas, and earlier in my life, and other mountain ranges too. And these experiences have been the most profound of my life. They are what I like to do. And when backpacking, weather really matters in a way it doesn't down in civilization. It impacts that very day, that hour, you live in it. This has always struck me as worth writing about, and is something to bring to my novels that is out of my life rather than my reading. So I've tried to find stories where these experiences could be put to use. And I think you can say that that certainly is the case in these novels, isn't it? In another interview with Brown Study, this is recorded by the writer of that blog, he says that research, whether it be of the primary or secondary variety, has become an integral element in Robinson's writing during the last decade. While writing the just completed epic Mars terraforming trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars, Robinson seems to have done everything short of actually visiting the red planet itself. And then here's where he quotes Robinson. There are some very evocative stereopticon pictures of the Martian surface taken from the Viking landings. The first time I got one of these pairs of photos to resolve, I was amazed because there was a surface all filled with humps and hollows to the nearby horizon, which is very close. The history of the Martian surface is different from Earth's because nothing's been worn down by water or plate tectonic movement. It's just an ancient surface that has been hammered by meteors. Then I went to Meteor Crater with my family down in Flagstaff, Arizona, and that affected me very much because that's a well-preserved meteor crater like those that pock the surface of Mars. He goes on and he says, there's guys in the Smithsonian Institute and the Air and Space Museum who were involved with mapping with Mars, and there's an expert on terraforming in Britain who's basically an amateur scientist who's done a lot of work on it, and he and a few other writers in Britain were always on call as well. These were the people who were helping Robinson, right? The topic was ripe for someone to tell a story about it because the real science that's been done about it had never been unleashed before. So I was in a good situation in that regard. Then, moving to how long the process actually took, he said, there was a sort of feedback loop between researching and writing. I learned more in between the publication of Red Mars and Green Mars. There were some very important books that came out. McKay himself published a cover article in Nature on the terraforming of Mars that really transformed that into a scientifically respectable question. It was a heavy routine of reading, researching, and writing. It's what I like to do with my days. It's my work. I spend every day writing, devoting some part of the day to writing, and once I get in the groove, it's what I like to do. It was supposed to be a 3-year project, so that basically doubled, but there was no helping it. I'd taken on a lot more than I'd thought. When I'd started writing it, I'd wanted it to be a big novel, a doorstopper, a 1,000-page book. I'd gotten about 200 pages in, and they hadn't even arrived on Mars yet. I talked it over with my wife at that point and some other friends, editors, and my agent, and realized that, well, we're looking at a science fiction trilogy, which is something I always resisted writing. Now, much later in that interview, he says something very interesting. From my education in the literary tradition, what I liked the most was a certain clarity of expression. The obscurities of certain modernisms I never appreciated. There's a certain power to clarity of expression. I think of it as a personal preference, but it also does speak to an audience that doesn't have to have special training in literature. They don't have to be English majors. I think of Gabriel Garcia Marquez in that respect, because American novels were very convoluted and difficult, and there were people like John Barth and Vladimir Nabokov talking about the death of literature and the exhaustion of literature, and that there were no stories to be told anymore. I think when the translation of 100 Years of Solitude hit in 1973, it just knocked the stuffing out of those guys. It's obvious from Marquez that you can still tell a story in straightforward language that is incredibly powerful. Now, he goes on and he says, it was also at UC, SD, University of California, Davis, right, that Robinson first encountered the Marxist theory that, coupled with Robinson's ecological concerns, would inform the thematic and political content of Robinson's work. And he says, Friedrich Jameson was one of my academic advisors in school. He comes from a more traditional 50s Sartrean existential Marxism that has to do with politics and personal freedom. He taught me a lot about political theory because that's his angle on literature. He tends to subsume the environment underneath the notion of a socialist or Marxist government, that if you truly want to be environmentalist, you have to end up being a socialist anyway in order to get there. And this is going to play a really important role, sometimes in terms of characters and what they're doing, sometimes in terms of the lack or loss of that in these novels. He goes on and he says, I've been thinking about utopias for a long time and looking at the world that we live in, and the discrepancy between the two is fairly acute. So I think about politics a fair amount, as much as anyone can stand to, but I think the environmental concern, it's a chicken and egg argument. Which is more important? Although it seems the environment is the real reality that we have to adjust to, and the political systems we make up are there just to get us in a right balance with the environment. So I don't have the same fix on it as Jameson does. Now, talking about some of his characters, he says, it's very easy for me to flip-flop between the Anne and Sax. These are two important points of view because depending on what I'm focusing on at the moment, I can really believe in one or the other of them pretty enthusiastically. But this is what makes me a novelist rather than a preacher or a philosopher. Incoherence is not an altogether bad thing in a novelist if you can sort out the strands and express them clearly. It means you can be even-handed towards characters and let them speak in their own mind. And at a certain point, Anne and Sachs take on these lives of their own, working hard on these books. I could get to a state where it was like taking down telephone messages and being a medium about it. And I feel that Anne and Sachs have their own integrity at this point, and that's a lovely feeling. That's part of what makes novel writing so nice. In the public books interview, he's being asked about Mars. Mars has been undergoing a renaissance lately between the publication of Andy Weir's The Martian in 2011, NASA's recent discovery of evidence of flowing water under the planet's surface, and George R.R. Martin's collection of old Mars stories in 2015, in which he laments that the real Mars was simply not as interesting as its pulp predecessor. How has the meaning of Mars changed for you in the years since the publication of your trilogy? So Robinson says this: I would disagree with George about that. The real Mars is way more interesting than the pulp Mars, which was just a fantasy space, often swapped out with Venus or whatever. And we can have both now, in effect, because we still export a lot of dreams there to Mars. I think Mars is a great place to think about Earth as a planet and about society as a constructed thing we're still working on, with the idea we could improve it. In specific Martian terms, the idea that there might still be bacterial life on Mars was not there when I wrote my Mars books. And that is a game changer if we take it seriously. Also, the presence of perchlorates in the soil, poisonous to humans, and the relative lack of nitrogen on Mars are new findings that really complicate the idea of inhabiting the planet and terraforming it. They're not deal breakers, but they're significant obstacles. However, even if slower, terraforming Mars remains a great long-term goal, but long-term meaning like 10,000 years, which means we have to get our relationship to our own planet in order for anything to happen on Mars. He's then asked, well, given your interest in questioning the future of interstellar travel, how do you weigh the massive investments necessary for developing technologies for space exploration with the need for investment in so many other less fantastic but equally important research aspirations? And here's what Robinson says. The main project for civilization now is creating a sustainable way of life here on Earth. That's the necessary first step. Anything beyond would rely on that succeeding, so exploring space is less important now. That said, space science is an Earth science. What we learn around the solar system can often illuminate the project we have here of keeping this planet's biosphere healthy. So I like the space program, and I feel it's not funded out of proportion to its importance. Robotic missions are already doing a lot of what we need done, but humans are better at many things than robots, and it's exciting to see humans on the other planets more than it is to see robots. So on balance, I'd like to see more investment in space science and less in areas like weaponry. Our taxpayer bailout of the banker gamblers who lost their bets in 2008 cost us about 10,000 times the entirety of what we've spent on NASA. So, very interesting set of proposals there on his part. In the building blog, he is asked, I'm interested in the possibility that literary genres might have to be redefined in light of climate change. In other words, a novel where 2 feet of snow falls on Los Angeles or sand dunes creep through the suburbs of Rome would be considered a work of science fiction, even surrealism today. But that same book in 50 years' time could very well be a work of climate realism, so to speak. So if climate change is making the world surreal, then what it means to write a realistic novel will have to change. As a science fiction novelist, how does that affect how you approach your work? And here's what Robinson says. I've been saying that for a number of years, that we're now all living in a science fiction novel together, a book we co-write. A lot of what we're experiencing now is Unsurprising because we've been prepped for it by science fiction. But I don't think surrealism is the right way to put it. Surrealism is so often a matter of dreamscapes, of things becoming more than real, and as a result, more sublime. You might think, for example, of J.G. Ballard's The Drowned World and the way in which he sees these giant catastrophes as a release from our current social setup. Catastrophe and disaster are aestheticized and looked at as a miraculous salvation from our present reality. But it wouldn't really be like that. I started writing about Earth's climate change in the Mars books. I needed something to happen on Earth that was shocking enough to allow a kind of historical gap in which my Martians could realistically establish independence. I'd already been working with Antarctic scientists who were talking about the West Antarctic ice sheet and how unstable it might be. And so I used that, discussed in Green Mars. And in Blue Mars, I showed a flooded London. But after you get past the initial dislocations and disasters, what you've got is another landscape to be inhabited. Another situation that would have its own architecture, its own problems, its own solutions. The blogger asks, Mars has a long history as a kind of utopian destination, and in that your Mars trilogy is no exception. What is it about Mars that brings out this particular kind of speculation? Robinson says, it brings up an unusual modern event that can happen in our mental landscapes, which is comparative planetology. That wasn't really available to us before the modern era, really until Viking. One thing about Mars is that it's a radically impoverished landscape. You start with nothing. The bare rock, the volatile chemicals that are needed for life, some water, and an empty landscape. That makes it a kind of gigantic metaphor or modeling exercise, and it gives you a way to imagine the fundamentals of what we're doing here on Earth. I find it's a very good thing to begin thinking that we are terraforming Earth, because we are. And we've been doing it for quite some time. We've been doing it by accident, and mostly by damaging things. In some ways, there have been improvements in terms of human support systems, but there's still so much damage that's gone unacknowledged or ignored. Even when all along we knew it was happening, people kind of shrug and think, there's nothing we can do about it, or maybe the next generation will be clever enough to figure it out, so on we go. Mars is an interesting platform where we can model these things, but I don't know that we'll get there for another 50 years or so. And once we do get there, I think that for many, many years, maybe many decades, it will function like Antarctica does now. It will be an interesting scientific base that teaches us things, and it's beautiful and charismatic, but not important in the larger scheme of human history on Earth. It's just an interesting place to study that we can learn things from. And then he says, but if you think of yourself as terraforming Earth, and you think about sustainability, then you can start thinking about permaculture and what permaculture really means. It's just not sustainable agriculture, but a name for a certain kind of history. Because the word sustainability is now code for, let's make capitalism work over the long haul without ever getting rid of the hierarchy between rich and poor, and without establishing social justice. Sustainable development as well, that's a term that's been contaminated. It doesn't even mean sustainable anymore. It means let us continue what we're doing, but somehow get away with it by some magic waving of the hands or some techno-silver bullet. Suddenly we can make it all right to continue in all our current habits. And yet it's not just that our habits are destructive. They're not even satisfying to the people who get to play in them. So there's a stupidity involved at the cultural level. Finally, we have this great Wire interview, retrospective. He's asked, Mr. Robinson, 30 years ago you wrote the Mars Trilogy, a science fiction series about colonizing Mars that won popularity all over the world. What would you say today? Is travel to Mars science now, or is it still fiction? Kim Stanley Robinson answers, that depends on the time horizon we're talking about. It's theoretically conceivable for us to send a manned spaceship to Mars in the next 100 years, but in practical terms, it's impossible. First of all, it would fall down on the costs. A colony on Mars would cost about $500 billion. The next hurdle is getting there. At the present time, it's expected to take 9 months. 9 months without gravity would have disastrous effects on our body. Our muscles and bone structure deteriorate without pressure. Then he's asked, if you get into a spaceship at the age of 40, you land 9 months later on Mars as a physical geriatric? He says, well, the process could be combated with intensive training as practiced by today's astronauts who sit on an ergometer for 4 hours a day. However, we know now that there are also chemical processes involved that damage the heart. The solution would therefore be the old sci-fi idea of creating artificial gravity by rotation, but we haven't gotten that far yet. And then he's asked, well, let's assume we get to Mars in good health. What can we expect there? It's cold, between minus 30 and minus 120 degrees Celsius. There's no atmosphere, no gravity, no global magnetic field, only weak local magnetic fields offering little protection from cosmic radiation. The soil is contaminated with perchlorate. In short, it's a place that's hostile to life. For people ever to settle there, the Mars colonies would have to be built meters under the Earth. All the same, Mars is still the best candidate for colonization. There's a lot of water, though it's frozen. There's carbon dioxide, likewise in the form of ice, and there's sunlight. These are three important ingredients for life. What there's not, however, as far as we know, is life itself, for example, in the form of bacteria. That's where we humans come in. And then he's asked, the key word is terraforming. What does this mean? He says, well, the word comes from scientific literature and describes the attempt to create a planet Earth. For Mars, that requires a highly complex industrial process. First of all, there's this thing about the toxic soil. The entire surface of Mars would have to be sown with a mixture of sand and bacteria so that the highly toxic salts could be consumed and transformed. Then we'd have to cause something that we want to prevent on Earth, an artificial greenhouse effect to release the frozen CO2 and warm up the climate. That's the only way to make plants grow and in turn produce oxygen through photosynthesis. However, at this point, we still haven't solved the problem that plants need nitrogen to live, but there's practically none on Mars. You see, terraforming is conceivable in theory, but virtually impossible to implement in practice. And he says, I think Martians, if we had them, would be like super Tibetans. Tibetans have passed through an amazing evolution within a very short time that enables them to increase the supply of oxygen to their blood cells. Life on Mars could possibly be like life at an altitude of 30,000 kilometers. People would probably adapt by evolution. They'd perform better, but possibly also be more susceptible to certain diseases. Then he's asked as well, they would be humans biologically, but what about culturally? This is actually a big issue that comes up in the trilogy. What kind of value system would people who've moved 400 million kilometers away from Earth have? Would human rights apply up there? And he says, well, we can only think of Mars as a mirror of the world. Mars may be colonized in 1,000 years' time. In other words, at a time when most of what we believe in today, capitalism, for example, or democracy, will no longer function here on Earth. When I describe the colonization of Mars in my books, I'm not thinking of a distant planet, but using the idea of Mars as a metaphor for a different Earth. How would we live? How would we organize ourselves? Are there alternatives? Because that's more and more difficult to imagine in our world. I extrapolate the question into space. How would we organize ourselves on Mars, for example? Now, I assume that we would try to develop an alternative economic system on Mars because what drives us here on Earth also digs our graves, capitalism. We are destroying our resources with our growth logic. We would therefore need an economic system that allows everyone to share and that protects natural resources. And if you change the economic system, you also have to change the education system. And if you change the schools, you automatically change the society's values and norms. So to answer your question, Martians would still be people. They would have the same needs, fears, and hopes. That's embedded deep in our DNA. But they would live in a completely different culture and would therefore have different values and basic rights. He's asked then, so your answer to the present crises is not the anti-progress degrowth that a lot of left-wingers advocate, but a Marxism that has faith in progress. He says, correct. We can't turn the clock back. We have to use our present technological capabilities to save our world. You could translate that as, we don't need to terraform a new planet, but to establish Mars colonies in the world. Islands that provide social crisis-independent basics. Now, isn't that an interesting idea? So in these books are contained, and probably you could say in a lot of Robinson's other works, the seeds for these Mars communities or Mars places, right? And then he says, to sum up, colonizing Mars is neither easy nor profitable. This is the interviewer. Nevertheless, both government and private programs exist, and we're seeing growing public interest in the subject. Where does the fascination for this planet come from? And Robinson then says, well, I think there's two different reasons for it. First, feasibility. Some of the things we writers merely imagined 30 years ago are now technically possible. Mars is still far away, but it has come closer technologically. But the second reason for the new enthusiasm for Mars is pure escapism. We've run the Earth down so much that a lot of people feel they want to seek a new opportunity on a new planet. I think the first motive is sound and just, and the second is flawed reasoning as far as I'm concerned. We'll never be able to leave the Earth. We're a product of this Earth. We have to rescue it. The crisis on Earth is acute. It has to be resolved in the next few hundred years. However, it will be 1,000 years before we can colonize Mars. So I don't see my science fiction novels as space scenarios, but as conceptual experiments that could help us create a better world here. The last question that we'll look at here, how will later generations look back on our idea of wanting to colonize Mars? So Kim Stanley Robinson says, they'll think it's a senseless, naive idea. But people are rarely interested in sensible ideas and are often keen on the technologically most extreme possibility. And at this moment, that's journeying to Mars. So a lot of very interesting reflections and speculations on the work, the process, but also how these books articulate an ideas that we need here on Earth. Before we launch into looking at some of the philosophical themes that are built into these first two novels, some of which we'll probably have to delay until next time looking at the third novel in the series, I wanted to touch on something that could be considered a philosophical theme, could be considered part of world and also plot and character building, and is also a matter of what we might call the literary construction and expression of these works. And, since Kim Stanley Robinson was somebody who came up within the milieu of what we could call high literary theory, right? Working with Friedrich Jameson, it makes sense to bring in some other literary theorists. And the one that came to mind almost immediately for me after hearing Jameson, even though there isn't like an automatic intrinsic connection with him, is the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, and specifically this work, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, which I think might have been the work that really put him on the radar of a lot of Western literary theorists. Because one of the things that he proposes about Dostoevsky in here that I think is a great catchphrase and really does apply well to this series is the notion of the polyphonic novel as opposed to the monophonic. So phone means voice, and poly, multiple, mono, one. And the question is, can we determine where the author, him or herself, fits or sits in relation to the characters, and not just the characters as such, but the characters as embodiments, but also as engaging and experimenting with ways of life and ways of thinking and relating to other human beings, what it is that they articulate. And so, Bakhtin talks about Dostoevsky as being, sort of not the only person who's ever done this, but as being a groundbreaker. And as many of his fellow literary theorists as not having gotten this, always playing the similar thing that they do with Shakespeare or with other people who have a lot of different characters. Who represents the author, right? And it's interesting, too, because I think that you can say that in some of Philip K. Dick's novels, they're equally polyphonic novels. Dick is not saying, I identify with this person right here, even though they might be the point of view character. Think, for example, of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where they're making important points and not completely resolving their arguments in relation to each other. Now, the scope for these novels is much, much vaster in time. You know, we're talking about centuries, really. Even the first novel, we're talking about, you know, generations, years and years and years going on. And so there's plenty of opportunity for people who have different points of view, which are going to be massively important in these novels, not just to articulate them as if they're sort of stock stand-ins for this person is the red, this person is the green, this person is this, you know, but rather to evolve their ideas, at least some of the people. So I wanted to read a few passages, just a few, because we're not going to make this a video just about Bakhtin. So he tells us, and this is very early on, that here we go. He's talking about the problems with the literature on Dostoevsky, and he says that an approach on the part of the critic similar to the uninstructed perception of readers who are continually arguing with Dostoevsky's characters does in fact correspond to a basic structural feature of Dostoevsky's works. Dostoevsky, like Goethe's Prometheus, creates not voiceless slaves, but free people, capable of standing alongside their creator, capable of not agreeing with him, and of even rebelling against him. This is what he takes Dostoevsky to be doing in his literature. A plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousnesses, a genuine polyphony of fully valid voices is in fact the chief characteristic of Dostoevsky's novels. What unfolds in his works is not a multitude of characters and fates in a single objective world, illuminated by a single authorial consciousness. Rather, a plurality of consciousnesses with equal rights and each with its own world, combined but are not merged in the unity of the event. Dostoevsky's major heroes are, by the very nature of his creative design, not only objects of authorial discourse, but also subjects of their own directly signifying discourse. In no way, then, can a character's discourse be exhausted by the usual functions of characterization and plot development, nor does it serve as a vehicle for the author's own ideological position. The consciousness of a character is given as someone else's consciousness, another's consciousness, yet at the same time it is not turned into an object, is not closed, does not become a simple object of the author's consciousness. In this sense, the image of a character in Dostoevsky is not the usual objectified image of a hero in the traditional novel. Dostoevsky is the creator of the polyphonic novel. He created a fundamentally new novelistic genre. Therefore, his work does not fit any of the preconceived frameworks or historical literary schemes that we usually apply to various species of the European novel, right? Now, he's writing this much, much earlier. Obviously, Robinson is writing much later after. This is not a new idea to us, and we can talk about many other people who create polyphonic novels, right? And Bakhtin might be wrong in saying that Dostoevsky is the originator of this. But I think there's something definitely like that going on in here, where we have so many important point of view characters whose inner discourse and whose arguments and agreements and critiques and reflections and engagements with other people we do get to see, And not everybody is represented in that way. There's many that we could say are kind of faceless, just there for one line, kind of extras. But there's a vast host of quite important members of the first 100 to land on Mars, actually 101 because Coyote has been smuggled on board, right? And then there's the children, and then there's the various immigrants who are coming in as well, and have their different purposes. And it's interesting because, it's not just the people that we would say are closer to Kim Stanley Robinson's own point of view as a person who are, battling it out and getting developed. We even get people who are kind of, sellouts to the multinational or metanational corporations, right? So they get some character development as well in this, and not everybody sees eye to eye. So I think that this is quite important, and they're engaged in a process that is about not just technological issues or political issues, like what kind of society are we going to have. They're thinking about the nature of humanity itself. They're engaged in some pretty, pragmatic but deep philosophical questions, we can say. Now, I want to bring up one other passage from here. He talks a little bit later about this guy Englehart, finally understanding what's going on in the Dostoevskian novel, and he says, "The hero's ideas lying at the base of this plane in the novel are as much the subject of representation, as much idea heroes as the ideas of Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, or any of the others. In no way do they become principles of representation or construction of the entire novel as a whole. That is, principles of the author himself as the artist. If that were the case, we would have an ordinary philosophical novel of ideas. The hierarchical emphasis or accent given to some of these ideas does not transform the Dostoevskian novel into an ordinary monologic novel, which always and ultimately contains at heart only one single accent. From the viewpoint of the novel's artistic construction, these ideas are merely full and equal participants in the action, along with the ideas of Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, and the others. What is more, the tone for the construction of the novel as a whole is set precisely by these characters." So he goes on and he says, "Thus, not a single one of the ideas of the heroes, neither of the negative nor the positive heroes, becomes a principle of authorial representation, and none constitute the novelistic world in its entirety. This raises the question, how are the heroes' worlds and the ideas that lie at their base united with the world of the author, that is the world of the novel," right? So, and it's interesting too, because he brings up, environmental concerns in that as well, soil, earth, something that has to be constituted in these, or, water, particularly. Think about Blue Mars, life, soil, all of these key ideas, and how are they going to be developed? Now, we do know that Kim Stanley Robinson himself has some, well worked out, evolving over time ideas about the possibility of getting to Mars, what Mars would represent for us, and the need to, we could say, get our collective crap together on this planet before we actually ruin the Earth for human life and most other forms of life that would preclude us even getting to anywhere else, Mars or anywhere else in the solar system. But, that can be a motivating force for a lot of the characters, but that is not the one single driving idea for this. Is there one single driving idea? I think that there isn't. Instead, it's a constellation of important human questions that are really, on the one hand, technological or political, but on the other hand, deeply existentially philosophical. And so I wanted to begin there before we start looking at some of these ideologies that are developing and clashing with each other and some of the problematics that are being raised, because I think that that's important for understanding the scope of this trilogy. One of the great philosophical themes that is running through all of these novels in the Mars trilogy is the figuring out where the human race is going and ought to be going. And this involves using human rationality, one of our basic capabilities, and you could also say human volition, which is very complicated, but we have a capacity to decide, to choose, to think together about how to do things. And you can't just do it all by yourself. You need to do it with other people in communities. And this is where it gets very tricky. And so I'm going to begin here with a passage. There's a lot of different things we're going to bring up as we explore this. Early on in Red Mars, this is one of the sort of italicized passages where Robinson is not having a character speak in their own terms, but it's kind of a bigger picture thing. So it runs, history has an inertia. In the four dimensions of space-time, particles or events have directionality. Mathematicians trying to show this draw what they call world lines on graphs. In human affairs, individual world lines form a thick tangle, curling out of the darkness of prehistory and stretching through time, a cable the size of Earth itself, spiraling round the sun on a long curved course. That cable of tangled world lines is history. Seeing where it has been, it's clear where it's going. It's a matter of simple extrapolation. But what kind of differential would it take to escape history? To escape an inertia that powerful and carve a new course? The hardest part is leaving Earth behind. And that is indeed what the characters are proposing, struggling with, living out, some successfully, some unsuccessfully, producing movements, factions. As a matter of fact, in Green Mars, there's a passage that I won't bring up at this point where somebody who turns out to be a really major character in this, Saxifrage, or Sax for short, laments the fact that there isn't anything like, what we think about from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, where there's a science of human history that can extrapolate forward. It's way messier, but that makes it much more human. And it's interesting, I'll say as also a reflection, having read through these now several times and going back to the early parts of Red Mars, to see all the foreshadowing that winds up taking place in who's saying things and the importance of the characters. So this also is in early on in Red Mars in the voyage out. Anne Claiborne is talking about not terraforming, right? That Article 7 of the Mars Treaty seems to be forbidding terraforming that so many people are talking about. And we get two different sets of responses to this. One is from Arcady. And Arcady is going to be giving rise himself to an entire movement that survives long after he's dead, Bogodonovists, right? And so he says, I would say that we should ignore that provision as well. And why does he say that? Well, because just earlier, whether they're talking about the treatise, he says that we can decide for ourselves. There are aspects of the treaty you haven't mentioned. Bases built on Mars will belong to the countries that build them. We'll be building American and Russian bases according to the provision of the law. And that puts us right back into the nightmare of Terran law and Terran history. American and Russian businesses will have the right to exploit Mars so long as the profits are somehow shared. I don't believe, he says, we should acknowledge these provisions for even a moment. So he is charting out a course that says we need to decide for ourselves. And he says, if you're willing to disregard one article about terraforming, you should be willing to disregard the rest, right? Let's make our own history, our own course, our own new society. And then Sax Russell says, all these changes are going to happen inevitably. Being on Mars will change us in an evolutionary way. And Arcady then raises a really important point, saying, no, history is not evolution. It's a false analogy. Evolution is a matter of environment and chance acting over millions of years. History is a matter of environment and choice, acting within lifetimes, sometimes within years or months or days. History is Lamarckian as opposed to Darwinian, right? So if we choose to establish certain institutions on Mars, there they will be. And if we choose others, there they will be. So he's setting out, a basic idea. So now we've got Anne who's saying we shouldn't terraform. She will become one of the, not necessarily leaders, but certainly inspirations for what are called the Reds, the people who want as minimal interference in Martian geography as possible, adapting human beings to Mars rather than the opposite. Sachs is charting this, what is going to be called the green strategy. We need to green up Mars, terraform it. That means bringing in life, plants, lichens, molds, all sorts of, bacteria, and ultimately changing it so that it will work for humans. Arcady is much more politically focused, saying we need to break with Earth and our orders and the constraints that have been laid on us and start doing what we want to do. And then we have Phyllis. Interestingly, Phyllis, who will become the sellout to the transnational, metanational corporations, becomes somebody who is hated by the rest of the 100. And she says, you want some kind of communal utopia, and it's not possible. I should think Russian history would have taught you something like that. And then he says, Arcady, now I put to use what it has taught me. And she says, advocating an ill-defined revolution, fomenting a crisis situation, getting everybody upset and at odds with each other. And, this is also representing an important point of view as well. The idea, we need to accommodate ourselves to the rulers of Earth who are giving us what to do. A little bit later on, there's this great discussion between Anne and Sachs, and there's this great line that they're arguing, and this was not a reply to Anne's point, but the substitution of another one. It was an argument that was very influential. Millions on Earth wanted to come to Mars, to the new frontier where life was an adventure again. Waiting lists for emigration, both real and fake, were massively oversubscribed. But nobody wanted to live in a bath of mutagenic radiation, and the practical desire to make the planet safe for humans was stronger in most people than the desire to preserve the lifeless landscape already there or protect a postulated indigenous life that many scientists assured them did not exist. So already Sachs and Anne are representing the red and green perspective. Then we get this, discussion about John and Frank, who, are important characters early on. You might actually wind up thinking that they're more important until both of them end up dying. John, actually, because of John Boone, because of Frank. And, both of them give rise to additional ideas and stuff like that. So, going on again, we have another key character who's being introduced, Michael, who will be there all the way through Green Mars, who is the psychologist. And interestingly enough, I'm going to say this by way of digression, there's even the use of Gramscian semiotic squares in this, something that, I used to tinker around with a lot back in graduate school. And he is trying to work out what the categories for people on Mars are going to be, how they're going to change. Then we get to another really important consideration with Hiroko Ai, who, by the way, has smuggled Coyote, her lover and friend, onto board. So it's not just 100 original colonists, it's 101. And as we're going to find out, Nergal, who winds up becoming incredibly important in Green Mars, is in fact Coyote's child. Now, Hiroko subverts the arrangements that are met and starts essentially forming a cult around ideas that she has. Now, let's see what these are. So there's a ceremony going on that Michael is observing, and she sat across from Michael and began to chant in Japanese. Avengia leaned over and whispered a translation, or rather an explanation, in his ear. They were celebrating the Areophany, a ceremony they'd created together under Hiroko's guidance and inspiration. It was kind of a landscape religion, a consciousness of Mars as a physical space infused with kami, part of the Shinto religion brought to Mars from Japan. But the idea is there's kami everywhere, which were the spiritual energy or power that rested in the land itself. Kami was manifested most obviously in certain extraordinary objects in the landscape: stone pillars, isolated ejecta, sheer cliffs, oddly smoothed crater interiors, the broad circular peaks of the great volcanoes. These intensified expressions of Mars kami had a Terran analog within the colonists themselves. Here we get to another really important idea. Hiroko called this idea viriditas, taking this from Hildegard of Bingen, that greening fructiparous power within which knows the wild world itself is holy. Kami, viriditas. It was the combination of these sacred powers which would allow humans to exist here in a meaningful way. When Michael heard Avengia whisper the word combination, all the terms immediately fell into a semantic rectangle. Kami and viriditas, Mars and Earth, hatred and love, absence and yearning. And then the kaleidoscope clicked home, and all the rectangles folded into space in his mind. All antinomies collapsed to a single beautiful rose. The heart of the Areophany, kami suffused with viriditas, both fully red and fully green at one and the same time. His jaw was slack, his skin was burning, he could not explain it if he wanted to. His blood was fire in his veins. And we see another, there's multiple references to this in Green Mars. Would make a lot of sense that viriditas would be discussed. And we see Hiroko teaching. Look at the pattern this seashell makes, the dappled whirl curving towards infinity. That's the shape of the universe itself. There's a constant pressure pushing toward pattern, a tendency in matter to evolve into ever more complex forms. It's a kind of pattern gravity, a holy greening power we call viriditas, and it is the driving force in the cosmos. Life, you see, like those sand fleas and limpets and krill, though these krill in particular are dead and helping the fleas, like all of us, waving a hand like a dancer. And because we are alive, the universe must be said to be alive. We are its consciousness as well as our own. We rise out of the cosmos and see its mesh of patterns, and it strikes us as beautiful. And that feeling is the most important thing at all in the universe. It's culmination, like the color of the flower at first bloom on a wet morning. It's a holy feeling, and our task in this world is to do everything we can to foster it. And one way to do this is to spread life everywhere, to aid it into existence where it was not before, as here on Mars. This to her was the supreme act of love, and when she talked about it, even if they didn't fully understand, they felt the love. So this is another really important idea, isn't it, that we find going on here. And it's, one that captivates many, many people. Going on as well, a little bit later on in the Falling into History section, we have this character, Jürgen, who is from Switzerland. And as it's going to turn out, a Swiss company is going to be very important, and Switzerland's going to be important as well in breaking free of the noose of the Earth-based transnationals. So they asked him what he thought of the debate between the Reds and the Greens, and he shrugged and summarized what he could of Anne's, Red, and Sax's position. I don't think they are either right, one of them said. His name was Jürgen, and he was one of the leaders, an engineer who seemed some kind of cross between a Burgermeister and Gypsy King, dark-haired and sharp-faced and serious. Both sides say they're in favor of nature, of course. One has to say this. The Reds say that the Mars that is already here is nature, but it is not nature, because it is dead. It is only rock. The Greens tell this and say they will bring nature to Mars with their terraforming, but that is not nature either. that is only culture, a garden, an artwork. So neither way gets nature. There isn't such a thing as nature possible on Mars, he says. And then John Boone says, what do you call what you're doing? And he says, we don't call it anything. It's just Mars. So we have some other perspectives coming up as well. And then we have this very interesting discussion of the Sufis who have come to Mars and have formed entire communities separate from the other Muslims there. And John is engaging with them, John Boone, and they're sort of explaining their lifestyle to him and a bunch of other things as well. So here's a little selection from that. Inside the building, a party of about 20 people greeted him, both men and women alike. The women were bareheaded and behaved just like the men, which again surprised John and alerted him to the fact that things among the Sufis were different than they were among Arabs generally. He sat down and drank coffee with them and started asking questions again. They were Qadarite Sufis, he said, pantheists influenced by early Greek philosophy and modern existentialism, trying by modern science and the Ruyayat al-Qalb, the vision of the heart, to become one with that ultimate reality which was God. There are 4 mystical journeys, Dew said to him. The first begins with gnosis and ends with fana, or passing away from all phenomenal things. The second begins with fana, is succeeded by baka, or abiding. At this point you journey in the real, by the real, to the real, and you yourself are a reality, a hak. And after that you move on to the center of the spirit universe and become one with all others who have done likewise. I guess I haven't begun the first journey yet, John said. I don't know anything. They were pleased by this response, he could see. And they go on and explain, that there's all these other things going on, and they show that a gift economy is absolutely central. And they're not just using like ancient ideas of gift, they're also incorporating, say, the anthropological research of a mouse, Marcel Mauss, or people like that. That's going to become important as well. Passing on a little bit further, there's discussion, which we'll get to a bit later, about the not immortality, but longevity treatment. That might actually be a topic we discuss in the next session on Blue Mars. Here's a very important discussion that is going on, and here we go. So John is being cheered, by a bunch of people, and he's giving a kind of speech as well. I'm only going to excerpt from this. He says, what can I say, friends? He says, look, here we are on Mars. That's our gift, and a great gift it is. The reason we have to keep giving all our lives to keep the cycle going, like in ecoeconomics, where you take from the system, where what you take from the system has to be balanced by what you give into it, balanced or exceeded to create all that anti-entropic surge which characterizes all creative life, and especially the step across to a new world. This place that is neither nature nor culture, transformation of a planet into a world and then a home. Now, we all know that different people have different reasons for being here, and just as important, the people who sent us up had different reasons for sending us, and now we're beginning to see the conflicts caused by these differences. There are storms brewing on the horizon, meteors of trouble flying in, and some of them are going to strike dead on rather than skip overhead. It may get ugly. At times, it almost certainly will get ugly. So we have to remember that just as these meteor strikes enrich the atmosphere, the human conflicts coming down may do the same, melting the permafrost at our social base, melting all those frozen institutions away and leaving us with the necessity of creation, the imperative to invent a new social order that is purely Martian, as Martian as Hiroko Ai, our own Persephone, now come back out of the regolith to announce the start of this new spring. And he goes on and he talks about, what this is going to look like. And then a little bit later in this speech, he says, the encroachment on that set of rules has begun everywhere, like a parasite feeding on the edges of its host organism, because that's what the replacement set of rules is. The replacement by the Earth people telling Mars what to do. The old parasitic greed of the kings and their henchmen. This system we call the transnational world order is just feudalism all over again, a set of rules that is anti-ecologic. It does not give back, but rather enriches a floating international elite while impoverishing everything else. And so, of course, the so-called rich elite are in actuality poor as well, disengaged from real human work and therefore from real human accomplishment, parasitical in the most precise sense, and yet powerful too as parasites that have taken control can be, sucking the gifts of human work away from their rightful recipients, which are the 7 generations, and feeding on them while increasing the repressive powers that keep them in place. So it's democracy versus capitalism at this point, friends, and we out on this frontier outpost of the human world are perhaps better positioned than anyone else to see this and fight this global battle. There's empty land here. There's scarce and non-renewable resources here. And we're going to get swept up into the fight, and we cannot choose not to be part of it. We are one of the prizes, and our fate will be decided by what happens throughout the human world. That being the case, we had better band together for the common good, for Mars, and for us, and for all the people on Earth, and for the 7 generations. It's going to be hard, it's going to take years, and the stronger we are, the better our chances, which is why I'm so happy to see that burning meteor in the sky pumping the matrix of life into our world. So another very important representation of where things could be going. There's some other interesting conversations that are taking place throughout these works, representing, articulating, developing further the positions, the ideas that people have. And we should say that even more important is the fact that by the middle and the end of Green Mars, we see a truly new society being developed, a new world being born, you could say. And a lot of this is going to have to do with opportunities that are presented. So we should talk next, not just about these positions, but about how the conflict plays itself out long-term and at certain crisis points, which allow something like revolutions to actually take place. There are so many philosophical themes yet to explore in this trilogy, and we'll probably have to put off most of them to the next session when we're going to talk about Blue Mars in particular, and perhaps some of the stories in The Martian. So some of the matters that are coming up here will get amplified there, but one that we cannot avoid, which is absolutely central to the narrative in these two, is the notion of revolution. And people throw this word around very easily, but a real revolution is incredibly complicated and unpredictable. There's often a lot of collateral damage that happens in it, and we're going to talk about one of the main sources of that in just a minute. But I wanted to call attention to 2 particular passages. So this is near the end of Red Mars, and Frank and Maya are talking, and he says, what happened? Or she says, what happened? And he didn't reply. She was working away at the video screens. Have you tried the radio yet? No. Well, she cried, exasperated by his silence. Do you know what's going on? Revolution, he said. How do you know when a revolution is actually taking place? Well, part of it is that people tell you that it is a revolution. And a revolution is something different than just a conflict, different than just a change, different than just even a revolt or a riot. It means a fundamental breaking with older ways and structures, and usually a lot of fighting and conflict and fog of war until some new configuration comes about. And in this one, we also see revolution being invoked as well in Green Mars, and they say that this is going to be a new kind of configuration as well. So here in phase change, when the second Martian Revolution began, the first Martian Revolution happens in Red Mars, and it's got devastating effects. Nadia was in the upper canyon of Shalbanta Vallis, north of Maneris, in the sense one could say that she started it. And how so? Well, because of some political discussions that are going on. But revolutions also take an awful lot of preparation, both in terms of factors that human beings don't really control as such, and in terms of planning, in terms of coordination. And that is what takes place. So let's talk about the very first revolution. And there's a few things that we can bring up. I'm not going to get into it in super detail here. But we find that here's in Guns Under the Table, right? Frank Chalmers is interviewing prisoners. This is as the revolution is first beginning. Who are they revolting against? The occupying forces sent by Earth, who are bossing people around, who are trying to keep the Martians down. So Chalmers interviewed some of the prisoners over their room videos, 2 or 3 at a time. He says, you see how easy it was to detain you? That's the way it'll be all over. The life support systems are so fragile that they're impossible to defend. Even on Earth, advanced military technology makes a police state much more possible to implement than ever before, but here it's absurdly easy. Well, you got us when it was easiest, replied a man in his 60s, which was smart. Once we get free, I'd like to see you catch us. At that point, your life support system is as vulnerable to us as ours is to you, and yours is more vulnerable. And then they're arguing about 1776, and, Chalmers says, you and your friends are trying to live out some kind of fantasy rebellion, some kind of sci-fi 1776, frontiersmen throwing off the yoke of tyranny, but it isn't like that here. The analogies are all wrong and deceptively wrong because they mask the reality, the true nature of our dependence and their might. They keep you from seeing that it's a fantasy. A little bit later, one of them says, it's more metaphor than analogy anyway. There's differences, but we intend to respond to that creatively. We won't be hefting muskets over rock walls to take pot shots at you. And they go on, and the man says, I suppose the real question is, will we have a Lincoln? Will we have people that can coalesce movements around them? And that does kind of happen. Now, one of the catastrophic events that is part of the revolution against the occupying forces is breaking the cable. Actually, not breaking the cable, but unmooring the cable from its top in the space elevator. And this cable is incredibly thick, heavy, and will devastate Mars itself. He says, we separated the cable from Clarke. That's what we did. The cable is on its way down. And they're asked, well, what's going to happen with this? Sachs says, it's falling. We have the figures of the descent if you want them. It's pretty complex. And then, he says, I can't believe it. This is Simon. The impact's going to kill a lot of people. One of the people replies, probably not. And those it does kill will mostly be UN police who've been using the elevator to get down and kill people here on the ground. And the cable does, in fact, come down, and it smashes up the entire equator, right? Not exactly the equator. They say the cable is 37,000 kilometers long, and the circumference at the equator is 21,000. It's going to go around at least twice. And then where is it actually going to fall? Well, we'll know when it actually does fall. And when it hits, all that mass disrupts the Martian landscape. And that is the crisis in the early years. Later on, we see that the Martians, as a complex society, are evolving. There's this great discussion in the section of Green Mars called Tarakat, At first it had been so strange. The Issei had done incredible things while the first 100 had squabbled, fought, fissioned all over the planet, started a war, and were now dead or in hiding. The first group of Japanese settlers, the 240 who founded Sabishi just 7 years after the first 100 arrived, stayed right next to their landing site and built a city. They absorbed all the changes that had followed, including the location of a mole hole right next to their town. They had simply taken over the dig and used the tailings for their construction materials. When the thickening atmosphere made it possible, they gardened the surrounding terrain, which was rocky and high, not an easy land. In the catastrophes of 2061, the falling of the cable, they'd never moved and considered neutral had been left alone by the transnationals. In that solitude, they'd taken the excavated rocks and built it into long, snaking mounds, all shot through with tunnels and rooms, ready to hide people from the south. Thus, they had invented the demi-monde, the most sophisticated and complex society on Mars, full of people who passed each other on the street like strangers, but met at night in rooms to talk and make music and make love. And even the people not part of the underworld were interesting, because the Issei had started a university. The University of Mars, where many of the students, perhaps a third of the total, were young and Martian-born. And whether these young natives were surface world or underground in origin, they recognized each other without the slightest difficulty as people at home in a million subtle ways, in ways no Terran-born ever could be. So they talked and made music and made love, and naturally quite a few of the surface natives were thus initiated into knowledge of the underground until it began to seem as if the natives knew all and were natural allies. Much later, towards the last part of it, we have this discussion here of what's going on. Praxis, now the Earth is in chaos, and that is what allows the Second Martian Revolution to happen. And that chaos is a war that's encompassing the globe of the haves and the have-nots being at each other's throats, the multinational organizations against a lot of the other remaining countries, and indeed religious fundamentalists who also hate each other, but hate the corporations even more. And then there is an environmental catastrophe. Sea levels rise incredibly, and not because of global warming just by itself, but because of volcanic eruptions, which result in a lot of the Antarctic ice shelf going into the ocean. Now, they're getting their information. Nadia kept her wristpad in contact with either Da Vinci or the Free Mars Safe House in Burroughs, and as they slid on, she watched both the car screen and her wrist, taking in simultaneous bursts of information. Praxis was sending up continuous reports on the Terran situation, which was confused, but not incoherent or opaque as it had been in 61. For one thing, Praxis was keeping them informed. For another, much of the current activity on Earth was devoted to moving the coastal populations out of the reach of the floods, which so far were like very high tides, as Sachs said they would be. The meta-natricide was still being played out in the form of surgical strikes and decapitation coups, commando raids and counter-raids on various corporate compounds and headquarters, combined with legal actions and PR of all sorts, including suits and countersuits finally introduced to the World Court. But these strategic raids and maneuvers were much reduced in the face of the global flood, and even at their worst, video of exploding compounds, airplane crash sites, stretches of roads craterized by the bombing of passing limousines. They were infinitely better than any kind of escalating war, which in biological form could kill millions. As it became clear, unfortunately, with a shocking report from Indonesia that came over the car's screen, a radical liberation group from East Timor, modeled on Peru's Shining Path, had poisoned the island of Java with a yet unidentified plague, so that with the travails of the flooding there, they were losing hundreds of thousands to disease. So this is all happening on Earth, and this is allowing something else to take place. The Martians have organized, and Nergal gives a speech that's quite important and actually quite rather impressive. Right? Nergal says, our bodies are made of atoms that until recently were part of the regolith. We are Martian through and through. We are living pieces of Mars. We are human beings who have made a permanent biological commitment to this planet. It is our home, and we can never go back. Now, as for those of us who were born on Earth, well, there are different kinds, aren't there? When people move to a new place, some intend to stay and make it their new home, and we call those settlers. Others come to work for a while, then go back where they came from, and we call those visitors or colonists. Now, natives and settlers are natural allies. After all, natives are no more than the children of earlier settlers. This is home to all of us together. As for visitors, there is room on Mars for them too. When we say, now notice this important slogan, Mars is free. We are not saying Terrans can no longer come here. Not at all. We're children of Earth one way or another. It is our mother world, and we're happy to help it in every way we can. But the obvious fact, Nurgle went on, is that what happens here on Mars should not be decided by colonists or by anyone back on Earth. A simple statement of our desire for self-determination, our natural right, the driving force of human nature. We are not a colony, and we won't be treated as one. There is no such thing as a colony anymore. We are a free Mars. Now, that's a great slogan. Well, we're going to rise up against the oppressors. A revolution has to involve more than that. What does Nurgle say after that? What we intend to do now, as free Martians, is to welcome every Terran who wants to come to us, whether to live here for a time and then go back or else to settle here permanently. We intend also to do everything we can to help Earth in its current environmental crisis. We have some expertise with flooding and we can help. But this help from now on will no longer come mediated by the meta-nationals exacting their profits from the exchange. It will come as a free gift. It will benefit the people of Earth more than anything that could be extracted from us as a colony. This is true in the strict literal sense of the amount of resources and work that will be transferred from Mars to Earth. And so we hope and trust that everyone on both worlds will welcome the emergence of a free Mars. And that is it. That is the, culmination and the articulation now of a revolution that is going to take place, a second revolution on Mars. And the question is, can they actually pull this off or not? And that's where the book is actually ending, in uncertainty about that. A revolution that is now a second revolution that is taking place, which will allow the originally Earth people, now Martians, to decide their own destiny. And it doesn't happen because of a grand intricate plan. It requires lots and lots of coordination of many disparate elements who want to see a better future for themselves and for their progeny. So that's where we're going to leave off with this first installation of this fascinating, rich, and so well researched and developed and outlined, sketched out, however you want to put it, trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars. Blue Mars we will get to in the next session, and we'll certainly be coming back to Red and Green Mars in the process. So I hope you can join us next time for that continuation of this, but that brings this one to a hopefully successful close.